Viva Las Vegas! We've got Casino in this Atari archive. Way back when the VCS launched around August 1977, one of its initial releases was Bob Whitehead's Blackjack. This was a straightforward take on the card game that used the paddle controllers, allowing for up to 3 players to take on a computerized dealer in the classic card game, where the participants try to get closest to a sum of 21 without going over. Whitehead explained that the programmers liked to joke about the target demographic being teenagers between the ages of 18 and 35, which counted for all of them, and Blackjack was one such game that he felt he'd be interested in playing. As you may recall from the video I did on that game, he wasn't the only person who thought so, as RCA and Fairchild published their own takes on Blackjack for the Channel F and Studio 2. And in the years to come, card games would appear on several other platforms as they launched as well. Gambling games were seen as something that game companies could sell to adults, and so seemingly everybody had at least one game of chance for sale on their game system. Whitehead had bigger ideas than just Blackjack, though. Halfway through development, Whitehead decided he wanted to try and expand it to include other card games. But due to a need to pump out product, he ended up shelving the idea. He would ultimately get the opportunity to revisit the idea and create an expanded card game collection simply called Casino, or Poker Plus, under the Sears label. And poker is certainly the big difference between the two cards. Casino includes stud poker, poker solitaire, and 2 different rule sets for blackjack. The blackjack on Casino differs slightly from that of the original release in the rule set options and in terms of player numbers. Standalone blackjack allows for 3 players, with the right difficulty switch tweaking victory conditions to change how ties are treated. If the player wins with 4 successful hits without going over 21, whether you can double your bet after getting your first 2 cards and drawing only 1 more, and when the dealer hits or stays on 17 or 18. The left switch adjusts whether or not the deck is reshuffled after 34 cards are used or after every hand. Casino carries over the latter difficulty switch option in its entirety, but otherwise has a series of changes to the game. For starters, the right switch no longer controls whether or not you can double your bet after receiving your first 2 cards. The game just assumes you always want that as an option in the rules. The switch does control whether or not the player wins after successfully hitting 3 times without going over, and when the dealer stays, but that's it. The game itself adds a new mechanic, insurance. If the dealer has 1 face-down card and an ace, the game will allow you to make an insurance bet equal to half your original wager. If the dealer has a blackjack, you get double the insurance bet. So basically the same amount you bet originally. If not, you lose the insurance bet money and play continues on normally. It's a neat wrinkle to the game, albeit not one that comes up often. Casino also brings in the possibility of splitting your hand. In Game 1, if your first hand has 2 identical cards, you have the option to split them into 2 hands, with your original bet duplicated. You then play both hands normally, winning or losing with each one. Since this takes up a bunch of screen real estate, Game 1 is only for up to 2 players. Game 2 doesn't include the splitting rule and allows for 4 players at once. That's Blackjack, but as the Sears title notes, poker is the big draw here, so to speak. The game's stud poker rules allow for up to 4 players, and see the players betting or folding after each hand is dealt until you've reached 5 cards, at which point you're ranked based on your hand. Get a higher value hand than the dealer, and you win the bet. The difficulty switches adjust whether or not the card is face up or down for the dealer or players, respectively. The final game type is Poker Solitaire, where you have 25 cards to build the best poker hands you can. Simply spinning the knob on the controller will shift the cursor around the screen, and when you're in the position you'd like, you can place the card at hand there. Once all 25 are placed, you're scored on each hand based on how strong they are. I will go on record and say that I have no real experience with poker and am probably not the best person to talk about it, but from a playability standpoint, this version seems fine. Even if you don't have a good sense for winning hands, the game plays pretty quickly, and the paddle controls are quite intuitive. Like with Blackjack, Whitehead was proud of being able to get the VCS to reuse player sprites to create a series of high-resolution cards, and the paddle controllers work well for the game. He said the logic of the poker game was pretty simple to implement, as were the rules, so really the challenge just came down to the display tricks. Casino also ended up being one of the early 4K VCS games, of which we'll see several more of towards the end of 1979. These card games naturally have a bit of history with computer and video games. Blackjack was an early computer game, with Los Alamos engineers running it on an IBM 701 in 1954 to break down ways to play the game, and RCA engineers wrote a version of it called 21 for their prototype Fred computer. Poker's game history is a bit murkier, but conversions of it in Blackjack appeared in David All's 101 Basic Computer Games and were ported around to various microcomputers of the 1970s and 80s. In the console space, the Blackjack games for Channel F and Studio 2 had essentially come and gone by March 1979. Any new Studio 2 sales at this point were on clearance through Radio Shack, and Fairchild would rapidly bow out of the video game space within months of Casino's release. But both were competent takes on the game. Studio 2 Blackjack even had a colorized version included as a built-in game in the overseas Studio 3 clones. But Atari didn't have a lock on the gambling game market. Of the VCS's then current competitors as of 1979, practically all of them had some kind of versions of Blackjack and or poker to offer up. The Odyssey 2 never got a poker game, but it did have Las Vegas Blackjack at its 1978 launch. This particular game uses the system's keyboard to input your bets and to decide whether or not you want to hit, stand, double down, or get insurance if the situation arises. Despite this, it's not actually terribly intuitive the way the information is displayed, as all the prompts are on the same area, just color-coded. It's competent, but one of the lesser takes on the game. On the other hand, you have APF's MP1000 Blackjack game, which has well-rendered cards that you could even count if you were so inclined. Defined areas of the screen for each player, and options to double or your bet or get insurance. This version uses the keypads on the controller and has different maximum bet options, as opposed to the Odyssey 2 free-for-all. 1978 also saw the release of Bally's Blackjack, Poker, and Acey Deucey combination cart. This particular take allows up to 4 players, like Atari's, and uses the spinner knob on the controller to adjust your bets. Also like Atari, but somewhat awkwardly, as depending on if the knob is in neutral or being pushed forward or pulled back, the game will adjust which column your bet is pulling from. This version does not allow for insurance in Blackjack, but it does allow for splitting your hand if there are only 2 players. Poker here actually uses the 5-card draw rules, with the tweak that the first 5 cards are all dealt face up. The drawing is done after the betting phase, with cards appearing in the center bar. The players choose whether or not they want to replace the card in the same column by pushing the controller's trigger, while that card is the one highlighted. It works. It's not a terribly elegant solution. It's hard to compare this different poker rule set to Atari's, but it seems perfectly functional. There are 2 more carts I want to mention that came out after Casino. The first is Mattel's Las Vegas Poker and Blackjack for the Intellivision. This one is notable as being part of the initial 4 games sold in the November 1978 test markets that the consumer electronics company Sylvania held in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. Moreover, this was the pack-in title for the Intellivision. This is a visually interesting take on the game that predominantly uses the Intellivision keypads to input bets, choose what move you'll make, and even what game and rule set you want to play. This cart includes several different versions of poker, such as 5-card stud, 7-card stud, and 5-card draw. There's even an option for a dealer's choice, where the computer chooses randomly from the poker variants or blackjack. During the poker games, players can push on the control disc to peek at their cards, though the manual suggests that you should ask the other players to turn away at that time. This is the gold standard for early gambling video games, and due to being the pack-in title for the console well into 1982, some 1.9 million copies were shipped. That said, after Mattel changed the pack-in title to Astro Smash, they reportedly only shipped 2,500 copies during the first 6 months of 1983. The other post-casino gambling game is a poker game called Casino Royale, released most likely in the 1981 holiday season for the Channel F by Zircon. This is also a draw poker game, and one that by necessity uses the Channel F's controller. Players can thus awkwardly set their bets, draw cards, and decide whether to raise or fold by pushing and pulling the joystick. It's not the best version of this game available, but it is fascinating that the console launched with Blackjack way back in the 1976 holiday season, while poker was very nearly the final new game to be sold on the platform 5 years later. And as for casino, as I said earlier, the target demographic for these sorts of gambling games tended to be adults, and casino is no exception. It featured prominently in Father's Day advertisements in 1979. But this also means that coverage, largely directed towards teens, also tended to overlook it. The standalone blackjack cart would be discontinued come 1982, and even as early as fall 1979, Atari seemed anxious to clear stock out of with consumer promotions. But casino continued to hang out on the market through 1989, albeit not in great numbers. Atari Corporation reported shipping a little more than 10,600 units from 1986 through 1989, making it one of the lesser sellers that the company was putting out during the VCS's twilight years. Still, if you want to get your video poker fix on the VCS, this is about the best you can ask for. And despite being essentially outclassed by Mattel's game, Atari's Casino is a perfectly competent take on these card games. At the least, you won't lose your shirt. Next time, we visit the wacky world of miniature golf.